Today we are looking at a case from the very end of the 19th century, so sit back as we go to the USA. Pearl Bryan was born to Alexander S. Bryan and his wife Susan on the 25th of October 1872 in the small city of Greencastle in Indiana. Pearl grew up on her parents' farm and was the youngest of their 12 children. She had a happy childhood. Her parents were quite wealthy and very well liked members of the local community. Pearl was described as a happy girl with a lovely disposition and manners. She was also very popular with everyone who knew her. She attended the Greencastle High School, from which she graduated in 1892. By now she was 19 years old, and to become known to the local gentlemen, who considered her not only to be very honourable and well educated, but also a very beautiful young lady. Her parents had a young 5-year-old foster girl living with them, whose name was Mary. Pearl was very fond of the child and would take her into town whenever she needed to do some shopping. The two were very much inseparable. But being the youngest child, she was always doted on by her parents, who had ambitions for her to marry a gentleman of good standing and who mixed in the more elevated social circles. Although there were many young gentlemen eager to win her affection, Pearl allowed no one to go beyond the line of admiration. Instead, she would often be seen in the company of her sister and always greeted passers-by in her usual courteous manner. At the end of 1894, a young man named Mr. Scott Jackson moved to Greencastle, along with his mother named Sarah. They had previously been living in Jersey City, and Miss Sarah Jackson was the wife of Commodore Jackson, who commanded many vessels and who had been considered a very respectable gentleman in New Jersey society, but had recently died. Mrs. Jackson's daughter was married to a Greencastle doctor named Dr. Edward Post. However, unbeknown to the people of Greencastle, there was another reason that Mrs. Jackson chose to leave Jersey City. Her son Scott had been involved in an embezzlement scandal after being accused of embezzling $32,000 from the Pennsylvania Railroad Company where he worked. He only escaped a long prison sentence by turning state evidence against his partner in crime, a man named Mr. Alexander Thet. As news of this scandal had never reached Greencastle, young Scott Jackson was awarded the most cordial welcome by the city's most affluent residents. He was always invited to the most prestigious social events and became good friends with a young man named Mr. Will Wood, who was Pearl Bryan's second cousin. However, he was very different to Pearl and was known as someone of a rather reckless disposition. Nevertheless, he and young Scott Jackson started to spend much time in each other's company. Mr. Jackson had ambitions to become a dentist and entered the dental college in Indianapolis. While there, Will Wood would visit him, and together they would go out, drink, and look for women of a low moral character. Despite this and his troubles in New Jersey, whenever Scott Jackson returned to Greencastle, he was considered to be a conscientious young gentleman who any father would be proud to have his daughter associate with. However, his visits back to Greencastle became more infrequent when he moved to study dentistry in Cincinnati. In the spring of 1895, Will Wood introduced his cousin, Miss Pearl Bryan, to his friend Mr. Scott Jackson. It was instantly obvious that the young lady was most favourably impressed by him. Although she had previously disappointed many potential suitors, she seemed to be very taken by this young gentleman. His reputation was also such that she believed that her father would be very happy for her to court Mr. Jackson. Little did Pearl know that he was void of any moral principle and honour, and his own reputation in Jersey City had been ruined. Mr. Jackson and Miss Bryan soon started to spend more time in each other's company. Mr. Jackson would borrow his friend Will Wood's horse and buggy and take Miss Bryan out. She seemed totally infatuated, although she was careful not to try and give the impression to others that she and Mr. Jackson were courting. Young Scott Jackson was not in Greencastle a great deal due to his studies in Cincinnati. He did not return home every weekend, and this meant that when he was back in the city, he was able to portray himself as a perfect gentleman. He was very polite and a member of one of the best families of the county. People believed his intentions to be honourable, and most parents would have no hesitation in permitting him to court their daughter. Unbeknown to Pearl, however, that behind Mr. Scott Jackson's charming and pleasant manner was a selfish and calculating individual who only desired to take away her innocence. In September 1895, Pearl discovered that she was with child. She confided in her cousin Mr. Will Woods, who in turn informed his friend Mr. Scott Jackson, who was the young man responsible for Miss Bryan's delicate condition. She hoped that he would take responsibility for his actions and marry her. However, Mr. Jackson had other plans. He wrote to her not to inform her that he loved her and would take care of her. Instead, the letters gave instructions for recipes and concoctions that he believed would bring on a miscarriage, all of which proved to be unsuccessful. By Christmas, it was getting more difficult for Pearl to be able to hide her condition, but Mr. Jackson still insisted that he was unable to marry her. However, he was aware that he had to arrange for something to be done. He told Pearl to inform her parents that she would be going to see an old neighbour named Mrs. Fisher, who now lived in Indianapolis. However, the plan was that Pearl would not get off in Indianapolis and instead travel through to Cincinnati, where she would go and see a doctor who would be able to assist her with her situation. Pearl agreed to this, and on Monday the 27th of January 1896, her cousin Will Wood took her to Greencastle Station and she boarded a train bound for Cincinnati. When she arrived, she went to the Ohio College of Dental Surgery to try and find Mr. Jackson. She was very anxious, and her anxiety only increased as she was unable to locate him. She checked into her hotel using her sister's name, Mrs. Maud Stanley. When she eventually located the young man, he was in the company of a roommate, a young gentleman named Mr. Alonzo Walling. He was 19 years of age and had been born on a farm near Mount Carmel in Indiana. His father died when he was just 3 years old, leaving his mother in moderate circumstances, with 2 other boys to look after. When he was 13, his family moved to Greencastle, where his mother kept boarders, and Alonzo started working for a local glass factory. He worked there for 3 years, until unfortunately the factory closed down. He then gained a place at the Indianapolis Dental College, but returned home every weekend to help Dr. Sparks, who was a local dentist. It was at the Indianapolis Dental College that Alfonso first met Mr. Scott Jackson, and by some strange coincidence, the pair met again in Cincinnati. For the next 3 days, Mr. Jackson prepared medicines that he told Pearl would take care of her situation. All were unsuccessful. On the 1st of February 1896, a farmer named Mr. John Locke was walking his dog. As he passed through one of his fields, the dog caught the scent of something and ran to a location near to the fence line. Mr. Locke followed, and to his horror, he unearthed a gruesome scene, a decapitated female body. He looked around, but could not see ahead. Authorities were notified, and an investigation begun. First, they had to identify the poor deceased young lady. Of course, the discovery of a headless body attracted media attention and public fascination. Rumours and theories soon spread, contributing to much intrigue surrounding the case. Newspaper headlines sensationalised the story, and this only fueled the public's curiosity. But still, the police had not identified the victim. At first, the Kentucky investigators theorised that the young woman was probably a prostitute from Cincinnati. They contacted detectives in Ohio, but no woman in Cincinnati had been reported missing. The young lady was found lying with her chest down on the slope of the ravine. She had her arms spread out, and there was quite a bit of blood nearby. There was also blood drops on the leaves in the trees. Authorities took the body to the Newport morgue. Bloodhounds were used to track the murderer's scent, and soldiers from the fort joined the police in searching the countryside. The Ohio River was dredged, but still, they were unable to find the mysterious lady's missing head. They did find her shoes, and discovered some strands of blonde hair on some stones close to the body. At the time of her death, the poor girl had been wearing a light blue checkered dress, navy blue skirts, and Union suit underwear. She had a light brown velvet glove on her hand that had been severed from gripping the blade of the knife. Officers noted that apart from her new shoes, she was dressed in shabby clothes. The deep scars on her hands and arms showed that she had tried valiantly to defend herself. An autopsy was conducted by Dr. Robert Carruthers, the results of which showed that the young lady had been around 5 months pregnant. Large quantities of cocaine were found in her stomach, which suggested that she had been drugged before being murdered. The shoes were very distinctive and showed that the deceased had come from a relatively well-off family. The shoes bore the imprint of the manufacturer, Louis and Hayes. The police contacted the company, who, after looking at the identity mark, were able to confirm that the shoe had come from a batch that had been sent for sale in the city of Greencastle. The shoes were traced, and the store owner confirmed that they had been sold to Miss Pearl Bryan on the 18th of November 1895. Detectives immediately went to Indiana and to the home of Mr. Alexander S. Bryan and his wife Susan. They showed them the clothing that the young lady had been wearing, and Mrs. Bryan confirmed that the clothing belonged to her youngest child. The mystery of identifying to who the headless body had belonged to had been solved. The poor girl was 23-year-old Miss Pearl Bryan. Pearl's parents and sisters told detectives that they became concerned for Pearl, as she said that she was going to stay for a few days with a family friend named Mrs. Fisher, who lived in Indianapolis, but she did not return. Eventually, Mr. Bryan sent a telegram to Mrs. Fisher, who replied saying that Pearl had not come to visit her. Detectives interviewed family, friends and associates of the deceased girl, and the name Mr. Scott Jackson was mentioned on many occasions. They learned that Pearl seemed to have become very well acquainted with the young man, who was studying dentistry at the Ohio College of Dental Surgery in Cincinnati. This was not very far from where the body had been discovered the previous week. Detectives immediately issued a warrant for the arrest of Mr. Jackson. They also arrested his roommate, Mr. Alonzo Walling. Both men were interviewed separately, and both denied any involvement in the murder. Mr. Jackson did admit to knowing Miss Bryan, while Mr. Walling said that he did not know her. Both men were taken to the undertakers to see the body, in the presence of the Chief of Police and Miss Bryan's father and sister. When asked if they recognised the girl, Mr. Walling said that it was Miss Pearl Bryan. When asked how he could be certain, he replied that he thought it was, from what Mr. Jackson had told him about her. The Chief of Police asked the same question to Mr. Jackson, who replied that the body was that of Miss Pearl Bryan. When asked how he knew this to be so, Mr. Jackson replied that it must be her, as her relatives were in the room. When asked again if he had been responsible for the young lady's death, he replied that he had not. The Chief of Police then asked if he knew who was responsible, but the Chief was somewhat surprised when he calmly replied, "Sir, I believe Walling is." Pearl's sister did not believe him and pleaded that he just let them know where Pearl's head could be found. But Mr. Jackson just looked at her and in a soft voice said, "Mrs. Stanley, I do not know." Despite their denials and the fact that both men were starting to blame each other, Mr. Scott Jackson and Mr. Alonzo Walling were charged with murder. The trials were to be conducted separately, with that of Scott Jackson commencing first. William Wood had also been charged as an accomplice, but before Mr. Jackson's trial began on the 21st of April 1896, the charges against William Wood were dropped, as he agreed to testify against both Mr. Jackson and Mr. Walling. The case was a sensation. It had already been reported that people had gone to the place where the body was found to take souvenirs such as grass and branches, but once the trial opened, Pearl Bryan merchandise was sold from a store very close to the Newport courthouse. The defence unsuccessfully tried to claim that Miss Bryan had died in Ohio and that her body was then taken to Kentucky, where the head was removed. The defence claimed that Miss Bryan had died during a termination that did not go to plan. Following this, she was in so much pain that Mr. Jackson used chloroform in an attempt to sedate her. Instead, he accidentally killed her. Her body was then transported to Kentucky, and as they feared that they would be held responsible for murder, thought that removing the head would conceal the young lady's identity. However, the prosecution presented evidence that countered this version of events. The coroner told the court that the amount of blood found in the area where the body was located suggested that the head was removed while Miss Bryan was still alive. Another witness was a gentleman named Mr. George Jackson, who was no relation to Scott Jackson and worked as a horse cab driver, informed the court that he had picked up the two men, along with the young lady, at the Wallingford saloon. He said that Mr. Jackson and the young lady sat in the back, and Mr. Walling sat in the front. He added that the young lady appeared very unwell, like she was intoxicated. She was groaning as if she was in pain for the entire journey. He said that the two men told him that they were doctors and were helping her. However, he realised something was not right and attempted to jump from the carriage. Mr. Walling then pulled out a revolver and threatened him, so he continued driving the cab. Shortly after crossing the Ohio River, Mr. George Jackson said that he was told to stop and wait. The two men then dragged the woman into a field. He said it was dark and he was scared, so ran off, leaving the cab and horse behind. The defence strongly disputed this evidence, believing that Mr. George Jackson had made it up. Why would they hire a driver when they had their own carriage and horse and were very capable of driving it? The fact that it took Mr. George Jackson 2 weeks to come forward as a witness, and only after a reward had been offered for information, and after the reports about the discovery of the body and the arrest of two men had appeared in all the newspapers, it was claimed that Mr. George Jackson could have studied the case in detail, and it was noted that when the two men were put in a lineup, Mr. George Jackson struggled to identify them. The gentleman himself had a somewhat checkered reputation, so much so that the chief of police in Springfield, Ohio, had expressed in the press that he did not believe Mr. George Jackson's story. In fact, following the trial, Mr. George Jackson was tried for perjury in a case not related to this one. Mr. Scott Jackson and Mr. Alonzo Walling were seen with a young lady at Wallingford Saloon on George Street in Cincinnati by the saloon owner Mr. David Wallingford and his porter Mr. Alan Johnson. Mr. Johnson told the court that he saw them all leave by way of a horse and cab driven by a third man. Mr. Johnson also said that the defendant had a beard when he saw him, although Mr. Jackson said that this was not the case, as it had been shaved off that afternoon. This was confirmed by his barber. The murder of Miss Pearl Bryan had been so widely reported and became so well known, not only in the states of Indiana, Ohio and Kentucky, but all over the country, and there were those who gave unreliable and misleading information, which had made it difficult for the police to ascertain fact from fiction. In all, during the trial, the prosecution presented 113 witnesses, and the defence provided 83. Scott Jackson testified in his own defence and continued to deny the charge, but despite this, on the 14th of May 1896, he was found guilty of the murder of Miss Pearl Bryan and sentenced to death by hanging. Alonzo Walling's trial began on the 26th of May and ended on the 18th of June. He too was found guilty and sentenced to death. Of course, the sentences were appealed, but the decision made by the court was upheld. A few days before they were due to be executed, both men were asked to write exactly what did happen on the night of the 31st of January 1896. They wrote very similar stories, both stating that Pearl had come to Cincinnati for a termination that would be conducted by Dr. Wagner. However, there were complications during the procedure and Miss Bryan died. These confessions appeared in the press and other witnesses came forward saying that they believed this to be correct. But this was not new, as people had spoken about the involvement of Dr. Wagner in the young lady's death before either Scott Jackson or Alonzo Walling stood trial for the crime, and by the time the trial started, the doctor had been committed to the Eastern Kentucky Asylum for the Insane in Lexington. Dr. Wagner's family strongly refuted these allegations, and when it was announced that Dr. Wagner himself was no longer insane, he also denied the claims. Despite a last-minute appeal to Governor Bradley, Mr. Scott Jackson and Mr. Alonzo Walling were hanged side by side on the 20th of March 1897. They each proclaimed their innocence to the end. Pearl Bryant's head has never been located. It is said that Scott Jackson had asked a bartender to look after a leather bag for him. The bartender said that it was heavy and he thought there may have been a bowling ball inside. The next day, Mr. Jackson gave the bag to a gentleman named Mr. Kugel. This gentleman opened it and noticed it had hair and blood inside. He handed it over to the police. Pearl Bryan was laid to rest at the Forest Hill Cemetery in Greencastle. However, to this day, her head is still missing. Throughout the years, there have been reports of skulls being discovered in the area, but all have been confirmed not to belong to Pearl. Detectives at the time believed that Mr. Scott Jackson had probably brought the head back from Fort Thomas in the bag and cremated it in the furnace in the cadaver room in the dental college. What did actually happen to Miss Pearl Bryan is still debated. Some people believe that her cousin William Woods was the person who was responsible for her being pregnant and sent her to his friend Scott Jackson, who agreed to arrange for her termination. The question, however, always comes back to the fact that when she died, she was still with child, and there was no evidence that any attempt had ever been made to terminate the pregnancy. But if this was how she died, why was her body taken from Ohio to Kentucky? And why was the head removed? Hello everyone, and thank you so much for listening. As usual, please leave any comments or feedback you may have, and I hope to see you all again in the next Brief Case